What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Twink Revolution. I'm Sam,
And I'm Gian.
and today is the day after the train wreck of Super Tuesday dose.
Yeah, that wasn't fun. The hangover is not helping either.
Yeah. Turns out wine and tequila are not the solution to all your problems.
Yeah, I started drinking as the returns started coming in, and the returns are still coming in. So I'm still drinking.
Yeah, I actually haven't looked at them very much because I don't like to just be tortured by the incremental polls coming in.
Whereas I do. I enjoy the sadistic thrill of that.
You're kind of masochistic about it. You're like, oh yes, torture me with your daunting political inputs.
Yeah. I like to see CNN just not calling states for days at a time. That's really cool. Watching sort of Washington State come in less than 0.2%, I believe, or less than 0.2%. Advantage to Bernie right now. So thank you to the 12% of fucking Democratic primary voters who voted for Elizabeth Warren in Washington. Well done.
Wonderful.
Yep, your contribution has been noted.
I'm loving all of the clear anti-democratic processes in states. I mean, North Dakota only put one poll in both of their biggest cities when it's 23 degrees outside.
Yeah, seems fine.
That's pretty democratic.
Yeah, 5-hour lines in Michigan all over the place. Particularly, weirdly enough, on university campuses and stuff. Yeah. They're fine other places. It's weird that in the suburbs, no problems.
Yeah, votes are missing in places like Texas. There's unaccounted for. And
oh yeah, just thumb drives, USB thumb drives, the backbone of our democracy going missing. And yeah, it's great. It's just a great, extremely normal country.
Yeah, nothing like Bolivia or anything like that. Wait, it didn't happen in Bolivia, but it's happening in your country.
President Xi Jinping, please liberate us.
Yeah.
So we did do an interview this morning, and I apologize if I babble during it. I was semi-coherent because it was very early, and I was quite hungover.
And under-caffeinated.
Yeah. But the guest is really great.
Yeah.
Do you want to say who the guest is?
Our guest is Ashley Frawley. Kind of blew up on Twitter a month or two ago.
Yeah, she's a sociologist and an author, and does quite a lot of sort of public outreach and popularization of sort of Marxist and materialist ideas, which might have been how you would know about her, but we really enjoyed talking to her.
So hope you enjoy the segment.
So we're here with Ashley Frawley. Hi, Ashley.
Welcome.
Hi there.
Thank you so much for joining us on Twink Revolution.
Thanks for having me.
If people aren't familiar with Ashley, she is a sociology lecturer and a somewhat controversial figure occasionally on Twitter for reasons that are sort of baffling.
Yeah.
So Ashley, I think maybe people in our audience would be most familiar with a video that surfaced of you talking a little bit about the value of labels like communism in the modern era. And I was kind of wondering from that, maybe looking at the US election and sort of how things have been unfolding there, from a purely sort of tactical perspective, whether you think there's kind of value in even labels like socialism, whether those have just been sort of watered down beyond belief, or is there still some value there?
Well, I think probably in the United States, the political landscape is so different that anyone vaguely social democratic is a flaming red. I remember a long time ago when I was first getting involved in student politics and so on, we used to have this debate about whether or not it was useful to carry on talking about socialism and communism because it's so alienating to most people, that the terms have become so heavy with the weight of the 20th century that when people hear it, they don't really hear what we hear. And so people that I respected and I thought were quite good politically would often suggest that we should abandon these labels But you can see that, Sanders has quite a following in spite of the fact that he's called a socialist and a commie and and so on. And it doesn't seem to be all that alienating. And one thing that I find to be kind of heartening is that although there's this side of that movement, it's not all about welfare, because that's kind of what's happened, that we've bequeathed to the right anything to do with the economy, anything to do with work and jobs and so on. It used to be that we would fight for the right to work. Now we're fighting for the right to welfare. And that's not really all that exciting to most people, to most working class people, because welfare isn't an aspiration. It's most people's worst case scenario. And so to treat politics like charity is not helpful, and it's also not really socialism, or at least the socialism that is about a step and a stage in history that's about empowering the working class toward a situation where they're no longer the working class. So sorry, that was a bit of a meandering answer, but I'm not sure how useful labels are. I do still cling to the word communist, because for me it refers to that future world of freedom that I think is possible and that capitalism creates. The world that capitalism is pregnant with, that we're fighting to release in some way. And I don't really call myself a socialist because I have no idea how to get there. I don't know what lies in between. And so I don't know, it's worthwhile to think hard about the language that we use and how it's perceived by people. And where we want to go and how we think we can get there. I think too often we default to these positions when they're worth sort of thinking about and fighting out amongst ourselves.
Do you ever see the tendency? I mean, as one who was involved in sort of radical student politics, the rise of people who are really espousing a kind of mainline liberalism. Kind of co-opting labels like socialist. I mean, at some point, right, it becomes it sort of dilutes the actual sort of power of radical labels at all, and our ability to even identify ourselves to each other as people who are sort of maybe working towards a similar political project or similar ends.
Well, I can't really speak too much toward the American situation. I am Canadian, but I've been living in the UK since I was about, I think, 22 years old. Before that, I was living in Greece. So I've been out of North America for a long time. And so I think the word liberal means something entirely different in the North American context. So I have seen that. I think in the United States, people who are what you would call, so when you say liberal, you mean like lefty?
No, sorry. By liberalism, I mean as in sort of mainline capitalist thought, as in bourgeois liberal thought.
Right. Oh, okay. Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that happen a lot. And people calling themselves socialists, and it just waters it down. But then, politics is in so much disarray, and there's so much, everybody's in their own tiny little enclaves that it's so hard to kind of pin down what people are. I don't know. I think it's worthwhile probably to sort out where we want to go before we stick a label on it. And I don't know. We're in so much disarray. It's so hard to think about how we could possibly build some kind of coherent movement. It's just the most effective thing is to atomize people, and this is exactly what happened when larger movements that encompass large portions of the working class were destroyed. Sort of the end of history, the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on. What's happened is movements have been fragmented into these sort of single issue campaigns. And we're starting to see less of that now. But in the 90s, it was very much like and in the early 2000s, it was, you were anti-war, you were like an environmentalist, you wanted to save the whales, and everybody was sort of atomized around these little campaigns. And we're still, although we're coming back together under these words socialism, we're still fragmented. And I think part of that co-opting of terms and so on speaks to that fragmentation of the left and fragmentation of leftist movements. So when a lot of these people who will call themselves socialists, they're calling themselves that because in the main they're feminists or something. Mm-hmm. They see themselves in that way, or in the main they're environmentalists. And so they're using these words, but it's just they're using this word that labels a fragment, and that's not really what it was before. And so I think we're still recovering from that situation, that sort of end of history in the early 1990s.
Yeah. So the left, as like it's currently seen, which it's like mostly self-identified liberalism, or mostly liberalism in actuality, seems to be inseparable from woke liberalism. Do you think they can ever be separated back out? I mean, you're on the Resisting Wokeness tour right now, kind of touching on this topic of wokeness in the current political environment right now. So, like, what is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit disturbing, some of the things that are considered to be left-wing ideas that I don't actually see as coming from the legacy of the left. If you think about where left and right initially came from, they're sort of the legacy of the French Revolution. So you had on the left the parties of movement, on the right parties of order. But also you had the right was more backward looking, was more interested in human difference, whereas the left was interested in universalism, and at its extremes was about pushing the revolution to its logical conclusions. So for socialists and communists, and for the Marxist influence on those socialists and communists, it was about if you wanted to make liberal ideals real, you had to have another revolution. It was not possible to have equality, fraternity, and so on in a world that was based on exploitation, that was based on a fundamental inequality. But at their heart, these movements were humanist, and they were universalist. And I think that a lot of what now is passing for the left it actually has a legacy in reaction to those movements. So when people looked out into the world at that time, you heard all these wonderful, lofty ideals: equality, fraternity, freedom, and when you looked out into the world, you saw war, unfreedom, inequality. And that needed to be explained. And the answer was human difference. People are just different. And we're never going to have equality because people have different aptitudes. People have different cultures. There was ideas of climate, that the climate of people affected who they were and so on. And there was a sort of more lefty kind of version of this old right, which was human difference in terms of cultural difference and celebrating celebrating the Volksgeist. And then you had a more right-wing side of this, which was which biologized the celebration of difference as race. But both of those movements were the right-wing reaction to the left, to the failures of the left. And so I think this obsession with human difference is very dangerous. And I don't necessarily see that it's very progressive. Although, I do think that there are times where it is useful and important to recognize that there are differences within the working class that can inhibit the ability to have a unified movement. And this was something that was recognized by people like C.L.R. James, who broke with the Trotskyite movement at mid-20th century, because they were saying, black and white unite. And he was saying, well, you can't really do that because Black people don't have freedoms, just basic freedoms that white people have. And so you need to win that fight first before there's any hope that Black and white can truly unite. So at that historical juncture, it was quite important and useful to recognize the difference there, not to just pretend like, yes, human difference in terms of race is a social construction, but realizing that it's a social construction doesn't make it go away. It doesn't make its power disappear. It's real because we make it real. There are real problems in society based on prejudice. There is institutional racism. And it's important to recognize that. So I think like the Black Lives Matter movement, I don't think it was helpful to say all lives matter, because that was a difference. That was a difference that was important. That you can't fight for you can't have a unified movement when there's that basic level of difference. And we have the same thing with immigration. Like there's clearly racist immigration policy that is meant to keep Africans and Asians out, and in particular poor Africans and Asians out, and out of Europe, and that is based on ideas of cultural difference. And now that is real racism. And it's funny because in a lot of this sort of, I actually hate the word wokeness, because it's but in a lot of this sort of quasi pseudo progressive discourse, it's about just like basic everyday interactions between people, as though it's like everyday people that are responsible for injustice, when actually most injustice is deep and systemic and isn't about everyday people, but it's a wonderful way to divide and conquer. So then everyday people become responsible for injustice through their attitudes, through their deep unconscious biases, and it just naturalizes what is a cultural and systemic problem. And then people get exhausted by hearing it all the time. So then when you say like, look, there is institutional racism, people go, oh, I've heard this before. So it's not ultimately helpful.
So you have been sort of hosting this Resisting Wokeness tour, the word aside, with Andrew Doyle and Douglas Murray. Kind of seems like slightly strange bedfellows, although maybe not. I'm kind of curious what the response has been. Does it seem like there's some broader appetite for like a counter narrative from the left? I mean, if wokeness is sort of our problem, as you say, right? We've sort of fully internalized this logic of sort of personal responsibility for, our culpability in these like ontological categories of say race or gender and things like that, and our personal attitude towards them. It's sort of our problem. And so is there any appetite for an actual response there?
I have no idea, because we haven't actually started the tour yet.
Interesting. I've seen the press. The press has been, starting.
No, yeah. So they've started the advertising of it. So the first event is in May. And yeah, I was asked to host the Q&A. So I have never actually met Douglas Murray. I've never met him in person. I've met Andrew Doyle once, but I'm familiar more with. Well, I was familiar when I was asked to do this more with Andrew Doyle, who I think is brilliant, and I know that he's read Capital because I know people who read it with him, and he doesn't let on. That where he does actually say, and sometimes in interviews, that I'm from the left and I'm exhausted with the left. So I'm a big fan of Andrew Doyle. I think he's really funny. I think he's brilliant. He's a really smart guy. Douglas Murray, on the other hand, I am obviously there are very few positions on which the two of us would agree. And actually, when I was asked to do this, I wasn't really that aware of who he was, and so I went and I got his books and I read the first couple, and I turned white, and I couldn't believe some of this stuff. But I think that it's actually quite important to have open conversations about this, because what winds particularly about immigration, I feel is really like it's an issue that's just really, really close to my heart. And I think it's really important to air some of these ideas, because it's when you can't have a conversation about immigration, when you can't have a conversation about social change, cultural difference, cultural change, and where that's coming from. It's not coming from immigration, but immigration gets scapegoated. It just turns people against it even more. I think it's when people express their fears about immigration, they're expressing fears about their own security, about cultural change, about the meaning that they ascribe to their lives. And I think it's important to have that kind of conversation openly. And what's been happening is that it's being shut down. And when people say something, they go, "Oh, you racist." Well, people aren't convinced by that, being told to shut up. They suspect that the emperor has no clothes. And I think also the attempt to shut down conversation around immigration and just to have like song and dance multiculturalism. Oh, it's so wonderful, people coming here and it enriches our culture, blah, blah, blah. Avoid some of the deeper issues and some of the deeper questions. And actually, I think avoids the fact that most people are not actually as pro-immigration as they claim to be. So if you talk, whenever I've talked to people who are, pro-EU, and then they're talking about open borders within Europe. If I say something about open borders for the whole world, they start to get very uncomfortable. And actually somebody said to me, they actually used the word swarm. Like we'll be swarmed, and this is somebody who thought of himself as very progressive and was talking about how racist Brexit was, and then you start talking about African immigrants and then they start talking about swarms, Well,
we've certainly, I think, seen open borders discourse in the US sort of largely driven by a kind of unconcerned coastal PMCs, right? Who are, their class position is solidified and they're not in any danger of maybe the worst effects of, say, open borders in a US context or in a European context, perhaps. But that'll kind of to express reluctance or hesitation around that idea will just get you called a fascist in some circles these days, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a real problem. I think people need to have open conversations about these things without worrying about being called a fascist. And also, I think it's a cop out that you're not really willing to make these hard arguments. You don't want to have that conversation, and so you just call people a fascist.
So, the sort of things like the Resisting Wokeness tour and appearing on smash hit gay shit posting podcasts is not your day job. So you have a forthcoming book called Significant Emotions, Rhetoric, and Social Problems in a Vulnerable Age. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and maybe how does it sort of connect to some of this public education and outreach work you do versus your sort of academic work?
I've also written another book called Semiotics of Happiness. That was my first book. So the main area of research. So my main area of research is social problems, and in particular, the increased tendency to psychologize and emotionalize social problems, so that all social problems essentially become problems of emotion, and emotions themselves become social problems. And I look at where that's come from and some of the reasons why I think that's happened. And part of the reason, so where does that fit into the public stuff? I'm not actually sure. I think that at the moment, the best thing that an academic can hope for is to be ignored. It's not really like a good time to be publicly visible. But I can't help myself, and I just say yes to everything. I don't know why.
We noticed, and we appreciate it.
I've said no to, I can count on one hand the number of things I've said no to, where I thought, first of all, maybe just couldn't do it, or the topic I didn't know it well enough, so I didn't think that I could talk about it. So that's about it. It's the only time that I ever say no to anything, even though I'm exhausted and I have 2 babies basically. I don't know why. I just can't say no. But also I have a friend who is my biggest fan, and he's always been encouraging me to put clips up on social media and stuff, and I never do. So I've been doing a lot of media stuff since I got my PhD, and even before I got my PhD. So I got my PhD in 2012, And right away, once the media kind of gets your name. And also, I used to be a drama teacher, so I'm very like animated and stuff. So, like I make a good guess, I guess. So once somebody gets your name, it gets passed around a lot. So I've been doing loads of media for years, and I never put anything up on the internet, because I feel like when you put something up, you're like, oh, I'm proud of this. I think I did a really good job. And I never think I did a good job. Like never. I'm always embarrassed, and I think, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or that lacked nuance. Because when you talk to the mass media, you can't talk like you would write a book, or you would talk to an academic audience, or you would talk to your peers who know what you're talking about. So inevitably you lose a lot of nuance, and that's quite embarrassing to kind of post that up for your academic peers. So be like, no, this concept that you use, it's not quite that. And I'm like, I know. So I never put any of that stuff up. And so one day he just said to me, look, I'm just going to make clips out of this, and I'm going to put them up for you. And so I said, all right. So my friend runs the main feed of my Twitter. Because if otherwise I would never do that. But and I think it's all like, although I'm embarrassed and I have very little confidence in myself, I think it's really good to put ideas out there, because I've always debated. I've debated since I was like 10 years old. I used to do like public debates, like debating competitions and speech competitions and stuff. And I learned so much from the opposition, because I'm just really stubborn. And I would, at the time, maybe I wouldn't think of the best argument, but I'd go home and I'd think about it. I would come up with a better argument, or I would maybe abandon a position. And I think I've progressed so much as a thinker from disagreeing with people to talking to people with whom I disagree. Even like I started to read a whole bunch of fascist texts, not because I think I learn anything from them, but from seeing actually what the other side says and believes. And most of my research is actually studies of ideas that I don't like. So I will research them very deeply before this is why I worry about using the word woke, because I've never really studied exactly what that is. So I feel uncomfortable criticizing it. I have this sense of, what it is, but I would like to do like a very systematic study of it. But anyways, so that's what I do, is that I study ideas that I don't like, and I respond to them, or I try to challenge them by showing what they are, rather than launching into battle against each and every one of the arguments. So that's kind of where the public side comes in, is that I think that although I am nervous and have no confidence, I do think it's good, and I do think it's important, because the pushback that you get, I think, is important and helps you develop your ideas.
It's a sort of interesting crossover, I guess, in that for sort of the lay public, there's a whole we see the tip of the iceberg, right? And there's a sort of easy dismissal of kind of academia, and then the crossover moment. So I'm sure as you've seen, right, can be pretty unpleasant. You can see why many have the tendency to sort of hide in academia and speak to colleagues in sort of the internal language of the discipline, for example, and not really cross over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I actually, it's not nice to have like a constant stream of people being jerks to you, like vibrating in your pocket. Like, it's not, and particularly like, I am a human being. I don't like when people like mention the way I look and stuff. I'm like, what? But like that kind of thing, I don't mind so much. The only thing that bugs me is when people loop in my boss.
Oh God, really?
That's just, yeah, and like obviously my boss isn't gonna like discipline me for sectarian Twitter spats, but it's slightly embarrassing. But I find that very interesting. That's something that I've been writing about recently, is why people are lobbying capitalists to have workers fired for disagreements. I find that really interesting. So I've actually like pausing writing an article at the moment to talk to you about this, because somebody actually, I was like somebody looped in, like added my university, and they were like, you should fire this person. And I wrote, wow, that's really Marxist of you to collude with bosses to intimidate workers. And he goes, oh, can you explain to me why that's not Marxist? And I was like, do I need to explain that? Do I?
Oh, that's horrible.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Why are we doing that? I think it's like this carnival. You know, the world turned upside down. There's this mismatch between the supposed gravity of the offense and the absolute glee with which people cancel each other. And that's carnival, you know? And that's like your high today, low tomorrow, and I won't let you forget it. Yep. And that underscores the power structures of society, whose power is enacted through the crowd. It was the king, you know, it was the sovereign, or it was the power that underwrites the punishment. So all that we're doing is enforcing the power of capital by doing that.
Well, it was sort of fascinating from the origins of the free speech movement, right? And sort of, you know, student free speech was that the whole exercise was to get the, you know, no gods, no masters, you know, get out of our lives, right? No ever-present parent. And now it's really kind of running to the referee and running to a parental figure is sort of like the first act. It's sort of feels like a strange inversion.
Well, yeah, but it's not surprising at all that we would sort of be using or rehashing these sort of medieval or early modern forms of public punishment, because what overcame that, not necessarily progressively, because just power just changed its locus, but what overcame that was a different understanding of the human subject. So the human subject came to be conceived of, at least ideally, as a rational subject, right? So I must convince you of the evidence, and we will decide. We're all sort of equals here, supposedly. When I'm accused of a crime, we have to show evidence, and that any human being in possession of a mind should be able to see this evidence and agree, right? Now, we're sort of losing that liberal subject, that which is the foundation of modern societies. It's crumbling. We no longer believe that human beings are by nature rational, have that capacity to reflect on their emotions and rationally decide how to act. And so power figures become, again, as they were several hundred years ago, more like parental authorities rather than as equals. I remember I did this BBC show once, and when they do this like warm up at the beginning, the question was, I can't remember what it was, but somebody said on the panel, well, what is the point of policymakers if not to set a good example for the rest of us? And everybody clapped, and I said, they're not our parents. Like, it did not occur to anyone that these are not our parents. They're supposed to be our representatives. They're simply supposed to be our equals. But they are, now that's gone. So it's this idea that those in power, those in possession of a mouthpiece or whatever, or mouthpiece, like a platform, should set a good example for us, because we're like children. We're going to enact in our own lives completely unthinkingly this bad example. And of course, that's a very bad faith argument, because I don't think anybody actually believes that. But maybe they do. I'm not sure. But when you have this, it's not surprising then that you get this kind of carnivalesque kind of public punishment where we set this example for everybody. You do this bad thing, this could be you. You know, you could be next. You'll be the next on the scaffold. So don't do this. You know, to set an example for everybody. So we're sort of returning to these like medieval forms of public execution in a way. And it's not I'm not reaching in this analogy, because under capitalism, you know, you have to work in order to live, or you live off of somebody else who does, or be a capitalist, right? So removing somebody's livelihood in a very public way is very similar to a public execution.
Yeah, kind of expanding on this like infantilization of the working class, which seems to be pushed by primarily professional managerial classes. I mean, we see it with like Hillary called like mother, especially in the gay community. A lot of them like will view women politicians as like motherly figures. And it's also kind of
you see this in Scotland as well.
Yeah. You kind of see that even the term progressive kind of is oriented towards like infantilizing the working class historically. I mean, things like prohibition and stuff like that. It's just kind of funny to see how the rhetoric of the left is so emboldened to infantilize the masses. I was wondering what you kind of thought of why this is the case still, and how do we combat this?
Well, it's a long story how we got to this point, but it is one of the biggest issues. And actually, you had mentioned before, you said, why, what's this, what's the connection between my main area of research and some of the public engagement that I do? Some of the stuff that I look at the heart of what I look at actually is this changing idea of what it means to be human, this changing idea of what is the human subject, who is the subject of politics, who's the revolutionary subject, right? And this is, it seems to me that although people will constantly say like, that, happiness discourse is this idea that policymakers should make you happy and we should have these happiness interventions, or now it's like mindfulness interventions or mental health promotion. A lot of the criticism is that it's trying to create these ideal neoliberal subjects that are like self-governing, aren't going to call on expensive services, aren't going to call in sick, are going to be nice and productive and so on. And the thing is, like, nobody ever asks, why do so many people believe that that subject has to be created? We have this like self-evident idea that human beings don't have those capacities, that by nature the human being is weak, vulnerable, quite likely to be led astray, without expert intervention, is unable to manage their family, their relationships, their self, their own mind. And that has come to be considered to be a very progressive idea, to say that human beings are irrational, that the rational human subject is just a myth. But when you do that, you have to understand that you are undermining the whole foundation of liberal democratic societies. Like think about like juries, voting. That is based on this idea that human beings are capable of reflecting on their experience. And, you've got all these emotions. Obviously, that's a huge part of life, but that you can reflect on those emotions and rationally choose a course of action. And I think, and that's just dismissed as a myth, right? But if human beings are not capable of doing that, then we've lost the powerful subject that is capable of understanding society and taking the reins and rationally changing the future for the better. That is a very important part of progressive politics, right? Karl Marx had this idea, we make history in the full light of reason. And obviously the famous quote, previous philosophers have only tried to understand society. The point is to change it by understanding it. If that is not possible, we've lost that. Then all of progressive politics becomes about protection, safety. And is it any surprise then that freedom has we bequeathed freedom to the right? Freedom has become a dirty word. This idea, in the end, it becomes freedom isn't something that we strive for. Freedom is a problem. Freedom is something that offends our well-being and our safety. And so we start to lose that progressive project. So that's, I feel like I need to explain, like all of my research goes into explaining that it's not inevitable that we've come to this position, that we've come to this place where we question the human subject. It's not the result of disinterested scientific discovery. It's a result of the failure of the liberal project to make good on its promises. That failure needed to be explained. The failure of the fabled equilibrium of capitalism to come to fruition. How do economists explain that? Human error, right? It's, our irrationality. Because we don't act in the ways that their models claim we should in order for the whole thing to work, it's our fault, not their models. And so the human subject has become degraded. But also the same thing has happened on the left, where why didn't the revolution happen? Well, workers were duped. They were written off. They were bought off. And all of a sudden, progressive politics becomes a critique of the human subject too. And there's nobody left to say, actually, human subjectivity is open, that what we are as human beings is the outcome of history, not the cause. And that is really, really important, because an open subject, an open conceptualization of the subject, means we have an open future. Because if the way things are today is simply a reflection of human nature, then there's no point in trying to change things, because it's just going to repeat itself. It's just human nature. That's just the way it is, right? So that's extremely important. So we have this tendency to infantilize the masses because it explains, it tells us why on the left the utopia never came, and on the right the capitalist utopia fails to exist. But what we need is a deeper understanding of the dialectic of human subjectivity and society.
So as you start thinking about like outlets for, I don't know, catharsis is too strong a word, but in terms of like the people kind of observe the horror of the world around them, and in that context, right, of sort of, I think, a loss of something, right, and maybe this is getting back to the sort of end of history idea, but the sort of techno-utopianism is a narrative that's pushed both on the left and the right, right. On the left, there's a version of it which, you know, I actually find quite appealing personally. You know, it's at the extreme, it's your full luxury gay space communism type thing, and on the right, it's like Elon Musk's you know, Mars colonies. I'm interested in sort of how you sort of view that. The purpose of all of this is sort of held up as human flourishing or indeed happiness. You would start to talk about, like, you know, the benevolent AI that will just generate happiness for us or something. This is an idea that's sort of regarded with some seriousness. I'm interested, does that idea sort of repulse you, or is that actually an appealing future for us to aim towards?
What, the technological utopia, or the idea that it's for happiness?
Well, so certainly, perhaps so we live in the heart of Silicon Valley. So the idea that the sort of the techno utopia will just necessarily generate happiness, and people use the word happiness, right? Is that, you know, the techno utopia, I guess, is part of it, but also a techno utopia predicated on the idea that it was to generate human happiness.
Oh, okay. Well, I think those are two separate issues.
Totally.
So, on the one hand, there is there's a question of whether or not the, I guess, acceleration, I hate to use that word because it's obviously, I don't mean like accelerationism, but like the movement of technology has some kind of liberatory property or potential.
Yeah.
I think that regardless of whether or not it has liberatory potential, it is happening. And I am optimistic about technology. I'm optimistic about automation, obviously. I am definitely one of those people who've totally fallen for the meme of gay space communism, because what made me a communist initially. See, I always loved astronomy. So when I was a little kid, I wanted to be an astronomer. And I learned that it was all about math. And so that ended that. And I remember reading about like terraforming Mars, and how a lot of that technology we kind of had, but we can't do that because that's not really the goal. We don't do things because we're interested in it. Our activity is always mediated by profit. And that frustrated me, because I realized that we could be doing so much. We could be engaged in projects that are interesting, and because we want to do it. And instead we're stuck here. We're stuck doing the same shit over and over and over again. There's a line in Capital where Marx quotes John Stuart Mill, and John Stuart Mill kind of wonders, what's all this technology for if it doesn't make us happy? And Marx scoffs, like, well, that's not the point of the technology. The point of technology is to increase surplus value. But as a byproduct, it also gives us the potential, if we could figure out how, it also gives us the potential to be free from toil. it could be that because you don't have to spend such a huge portion of your life like pounding millet, I don't know, gathering grain, making your own shoes, all that stuff. You're free to think and create. But of course, the point of automating all of those things or socializing those processes, as we've inadvertently done, is not to give us freedom. And so the question is, how do we subordinate those things to human ends? How do we remove that mediation? Is it possible to do that? Is it possible? We've the 20th century tells us our attempts to overcome the law of value have failed. And I don't think that's a small thing. We really need to grapple with that. How do we replace the market? Can we replace the market? People who call themselves socialists and say, oh, all we need to do is X. It's not a small thing. We're this is the question of human beings. This is the question of not just our times, but we've come to this moment as human beings throughout history where this question appears to us. Can we use this technology? We have these enormous forces of production at our disposal. Can we turn them to human ends? Is that possible without the market? I mean, I wish that was the question that we were sort of pondering today. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought now.
No, go on.
About technology. So technology has that potential, but in terms of whether or not it's for happiness, I don't care what it's for. Happiness is a part of a social relation. So there's no point in saying human beings need X, because human need is contextual. It arises at a particular time. So what is a human need now for happiness is going to be different than what it is 100 years, than what it was 200 years ago. I think Marx had a more negative version of happiness, or a more negative freedom than we are willing to have today, in that history hasn't even begun yet. When we figure out how to enslave the machines, we figure out how to become the watchman of the machines, as he says in the Grundrisse, then history begins. When we are no longer alienated from our ends, when we are able to act on the world consciously and in an unmediated way, we don't even know what that future will be, but we know that we will overcome the barriers to human freedom that currently exist.
Thank you for rescuing from my semi-articulate question an answer that really did get to the heart of it. I guess the only other thing I kind of want to ask about this specific sort of the capitalist structure underpinning most technological progress is almost how disappointing it is, and whether you sort of feel that disappointment. And there's great gains, but it seems like most of where our least risk-averse capital as a society goes on, not on even sort of big moonshots and building us Mars colonies because they could be profitable, for example. It's on sort of weird arbitrage projects, or these kind of profiting massively on kind of weird temporary market distortions or inefficiencies, and that almost feels prior to the question of sort of what is all of this for, as much as are we even doing it anymore?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a really good point. I love the way that you put that. Yeah. I mean, this really tells us that I think capitalism is a transitory system, which is both optimistic and truly terrifying, because we have nothing to replace it. There's this abyss that separates where we are now from a possible human future, where we can see that we have the ability to produce so much for everyone, to create a basis of comfort that will free people. When you free people from the threat of starvation or from insecurity, you potentially free people to think and create, and do whatever you want. We can see that we can do that. But before we can ever get there, there's crisis and war and the crises of profitability, throwing people out of the market, a humongous and growing population of quote unquote useless people. Useless, of course, for capital, because how could any human being with a mind that can think and hands that can work possibly be useless? I mean, just all this wasted potential. And we see it wasted now as well, where why would you bother investing in real technology when it is just so much more profitable to give, for instance, young people student loans that they can't possibly get out of ever, and just create these enormous bubbles. I mean, it's perfectly logical and rational to do that. It's not irrational. If you want to, capitalism isn't a charity. You want to get a return on your investment. Well, why would you invest in making actual things when the market has to be cleared? When you have to sell all that stuff. Why would you do that? There's a risk involved. The least risky thing is to just toss your money into bubbles.
Yep. And so, if committed young socialists are currently working at Goldman Sachs or something, they probably wouldn't even agree that, I don't know, going and turning their quantitative analysis skills over to like the socialist planning question would be worthwhile yet, right? I mean, it's kind of sad. That's where our generation's minds are going on. Yeah, exactly. How do I manufacture that next weird bubble or temporary distortion?
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame, and also like our best minds on the left are like wasted hours and hours and hours on Twitter. Like, no, I'm just kidding. But no, we're like, yeah, I mean, we're not really thinking about that either on the left. But the thing is, like, I also recognize I'm not 100% sure how useful like future blueprints are. So it's kind of like a tough situation, because you don't want to set up like these utopian kind of ideals. You're going to throw everything down, in order to erect without knowing whether or not they have any hope of working, on a grand scale. Like, the whole blueprint idea is also difficult, but that's why most of our energy needs to go into understanding what capitalism is and where it's taking us, because there will always be within capitalism these ways of doing things that are outgrowing the bonds of this particular system. And the question is, what are those things? And how do we nurture them, or how do we understand them? How do we take them to their logical conclusions? And I think that's the most that you can do. And I don't know what that is, but I really enjoy reading the work of people who are trying to think about this stuff. So there are people who are trying to sort out like the socialist planning question, or I really like Lee Phillips, yes. Although I don't really at this point agree with anybody. I haven't like gravitated to anyone in particular. I'm still trying to sort it out for myself. I don't know. I'd be interested. Do you know?
Yeah, no, I wish. There was a copy of the People's Republic of Walmart sort of sitting next to me, like Chekhov's gun. So it was always going to come up eventually, I suppose. But
I'd like to have these conversations as well, and I do think it's also fruitful to talk to or to listen to non-Marxist ideas, because what's interesting is that mainstream economists accidentally stumble across some home truths as well. Like, I remember I was. Because I teach like a first year, just like an intro to economics of social policy class. And so I go through like Schumpeter, and I go through comparing sort of mainstream or non-Marxist understandings of crisis, and I compare them to Marxist understandings of crisis. But once when I was, going through the literature ahead of a lecture, I came across these like just completely unaware, these mainstream economists going, "Oh, there seems to be a problem with profitability. It's been going on for like." Seems to be going on for quite some time. Yeah, and I found that really, really interesting. And even I think I think some of the worst economics, I think they're all trying to explain something. They're all trying to explain the same thing. And it's interesting the different sort of ways that they try to do that. So I mentioned before, like human behavior becomes really, really important. And you can see like with Vilfredo Pareto, who is one of the earliest kind of equilibrium thinkers. So he takes these models from the natural sciences and uses them to understand economics. And he says, like, it's amazing. The economic system works in this perfect equilibrium. But then when he looks out in the world, he doesn't see that, right? You see the norm is not equilibrium, it's disequilibrium. And he becomes more and more frustrated with human behavior because people are not acting in the ways that they're supposed to make that work. You can see that it works perfectly on paper, but then when you look out into the world, it doesn't. And I find that very interesting. He became more and more sympathetic to fascist movements as well. Although, of course, it's controversial to what extent he was a proto-fascist. But I think those kinds of ideas are really mainstream now. This idea that ultimately it is human beings that just keep messing it up, and ever it shall be. You know, yep. And you can see that in all across different sorts of movements, from, like race realist movements to what sound like really positive mental health awareness movements, which are very kindly talking about how we're all very disordered and it's quite understandable why we can't do the right thing, so that you see this kind of basic blame for tossed at human beings all across society. So I think it's useful to not just talk to Marxists, but also to look at how these things are explained in all sorts of different sectors of society.
Yeah, so I saw one of your videos on your Twitter, and you brought up the idea of decolonization rhetoric being a possible tool for a term which I never heard before, deep colonization. I was really curious to know, like, what does that actually mean? Because I tried to look it up, and it was behind a lot of academic paywalls, and I was not willing to pay for that. So, can you tell us what deep colonization is and how that ties into decolonization rhetoric?
Yeah, so that I think that clip was from a paper that I gave at a conference. I'm not sure. There's like a couple of times that that's been clipped. But anyways, so I wrote this paper for a journal, where I sort of wrote up the results of this study that I've been doing, looking at Indigenous parenting in Canada and discourses surrounding Indigenous parenting and the way that it fits into these kinds of causal stories about why Indigenous people have social problems. And I've obviously, like, I'm Ojibwe, and I feel this really close to my heart. And so I was reading these like parenting manuals, and I just got more and more pissed off because through this kind language of oh, we understand, and the women are so important and powerful, and empower women, it's the same bloody thing that they've been saying, for a century about Indigenous women, but it's just recast in this lovely sounding therapeutic supportive language. So when they were, hunting down Indigenous kids, rounding them up and sending them off to residential schools, or during the 60s scoop when there were large numbers of kids taken into social care, there was this idea that the Indigenous mother or parent was incapable of raising the liberal citizen, so children who were capable of living in Canadian society, because they were, this sort of same sort of colonialist idea of the non-Western subject, which is, hypersexualized, unable to contain appetites for food, sex, and so on, close to nature, not close to rationality and God as the Western subject was. And you see, and that was like sort of the justification, the thinly veiled justification for taking kids away. Now you see the same exact thing, but in the language of like care and mental health. And they're saying things like, like in the past, we were totally wrong about that. Sorry, guys. But now, because of that past, you are truly unable to take care of your children. Yes, we know it's the fault of that past Canadian government that you're so traumatized, that your mental health has suffered so much from colonization, and that's why we're taking your children away. Sorry, we're very sorry. So they're calling it now the Millennium Scoop. That there's a crisis in the number of children being taken from their families. And there's like controversial practices like birth alert. So they started to take social workers were sending out alerts when quote unquote at risk babies were being born, and the vast majority of these were for Indigenous women giving birth. They were sterilizing. There's a class action lawsuit going on at the moment because women claim that they were sterilized as late as 2017.
Wow.
And you can damn well bet that they were not sterilizing women because of some conscious eugenic program. They were probably doing it because they were like, oh, these children are at risk, right? Because, yeah, if you grew up in poverty, you are quote unquote at risk because poor people wind up staying poor. And there's the problems on reserves have become these sort of insoluble problems. There's a lack of infrastructure, but also the idea of infrastructure itself has been associated with colonization. The whole pipeline debates and so on. So like half my family is like totally against the pipeline. The other half is like, yeah, we need jobs. So, so these are like real serious issues, right? But they've become therapeutized. They become about the problems on reserves become about cycles of trauma, and the solutions to which are much more soluble, right? If the problem is psychological, then the solution is psychological. And people are stupid. Like my dad says, like, oh yeah, he's like, I'm like telling my dad this like big complicated story, and he goes, oh yeah, no, they just give us therapy. Like you therapists are a dime a dozen. You want a job? Screw you. And he's like, it's a lot cheaper to just promise people therapy and ask and act as though you're doing something. And also, there's this huge social problems industry. So tons and tons of money goes into Indigenous social problems, but it goes to this social problems industry of people who are invested in the problem of the Indigenous mother, the Indigenous child, and so on. This idea of deep colonization is basically the language, colonialist language that is portrayed in a way that is kind and that is intended to bring the Indigenous subject on side. Another concept that I find very useful comes from Yang Ji, who's a Chinese sociologist. She uses this in the Chinese context, but she calls it kindly power. Power that acts through a caring language of support, of psychological help, vulnerability that flatters one's sense of vulnerability and promises to offer support in that arena. So if you look, she does these studies of like Chinese workers who, for instance, get laid off in factories. And now this potentially could create a very dangerous situation for the state, right? Because those people laid off in the factory can band together and take over the factory, right? Or they can demand their right to work. And so what winds up happening is through this sort of kindly power, they divide and conquer, and they relabel these people's feelings as individual problems. So you're like a depressed individual, as opposed to like this kind of like radical anger that could be directed at the state, that could be quite dangerous. They contain it through these sort of psychological discourses. And so this is basically a form of deep colonization. So it portrays itself as decolonization, as making up. In the indigenous context, it portrays itself as making up for the mistakes of the past, but is actually simply a repetition of past policy through a kindly therapeutic discourse.
I think that's about all we have time for, unfortunately. I'm sure we could detain you forever.
No, I'm sorry, and I'll sorry, it was like very, very long-winded.
No, that was wonderful. Ashley Frawley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm going to plug some things. Your Twitter is at Ashley A. Frawley on Twitter. ResistingWokeness.com is the tour you'll be part of in May, right? Cool. Anything else you want to plug while we're here?
No, I mean, like, you can have a look at my academic work if you're an academic, but I also write a lot for, popular magazines and so on. So, if you're going to criticize me, just like have a gander at the fullness of what I write, and you can criticize that. That's fine.
Yeah, if you want to send abuse to Ashley, you can send it to go to hell at gmail.com. go fuck yourself.com. Cool. No, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.